The canvas of the sky bled a bruised purple where the sun had abandoned it, mirroring the desolation in Ilara's heart. Each gust of wind across the high plains was a raw, scouring hand, stripping away the last vestiges of warmth, of hope. The wagon ruts, already days old, were shallow graves in the dust, mocking reminders of the life that had rumbled on without her, deliberately leaving her behind. They had called it mercy, a swift end rather than a burden. Her husband, Thomas, barely cold in his hastily dug grave miles back, would have thrashed them for it. But Thomas was gone, and with him, her place, her protection. Now, only the vast, indifferent land remained, a canvas of muted ochres and dying greens under a sky that promised a cold, star-filled night. Her small bundle of belongings, a pathetic testament to a shattered life, lay beside her. The water in her canteen was a memory, her throat a rasping passage for the dry air. Each breath was a testament to their cruelty, each heartbeat a defiant protest against the emptiness they had consigned her to. She had screamed until her voice was a shred, then wept until her eyes were swollen and gritty with dust. Now, a brittle numbness encased her, a fragile shield against the terror that gnawed at the edges of her resolve. The silence was the worst, broken only by the keening wind and the frantic thumping of her own pulse. It was a silence that spoke of predators, of exposure, of a slow, lonely demise. The prairie stretched, an endless, undulating sea of sere grass and rock, offering no solace, no sanctuary. She pulled her thin shawl tighter, a futile gesture against the encroaching chill that was as much in her bones as in the air. This, then, was to be her final tableau, a woman discarded, swallowed by the immensity of an unfeeling world. As twilight deepened, casting long, skeletal shadows from the sparse, twisted junipers, a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision made her heart seize. It was too fluid for a deer, too deliberate for a coyote. Her breath hitched. This was it. The end she had been bracing for, yet was utterly unprepared to meet. The figure solidified from the deepening gloom, a silhouette against the fading light, mounted and still. Not a settler. The way he sat his horse, the lines of him, spoke of something older, something intrinsic to this harsh land. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced through Ilara's numbness. She had heard tales, whispered around campfires, of the Dine, the Navajo. Tales shaded with fear, with misunderstanding, with the inherent bias of those who sought to claim this land as their own. He was a warrior, she knew it instinctively. Alone, she was nothing. Less than nothing. A broken piece of a foreign world, trespassing on sacred ground. He made no move, simply watched. The silence stretched, taut and vibrating, filled only with the soughing wind and the frantic beat of her own heart, a wild bird trapped in her ribs. She could not run, there was nowhere to go. She could not fight, she had nothing to fight with. All she could do was wait, a small, trembling offering to the vast, uncaring wilderness and its silent, watchful inhabitant. The air grew colder, the stars beginning to prick the darkening velvet of the sky, indifferent witnesses to her plight. Her fingers, stiff and aching, clutched the rough fabric of her shawl. Was this a slower, more terrifying death than the one the settlers had envisioned for her? The thought was a fresh wave of despair, washing over the fragile barricade she had erected. He was an extension of the landscape itself, stark, unyielding, and ancient. His stillness was more unnerving than any overt threat. It spoke of patience, of assessment, of a power she could not comprehend. Her mind, reeling from exhaustion and fear, conjured images from the settlers' fearful stories, savagery, cruelty. Yet, in his stillness, there was also a strange kind of dignity, a rootedness that shamed the frantic scrabbling of her own people across this land. The darkness was nearly complete now, the world reduced to shapes and shadows. Still, he watched. And Ilara, huddled and broken, watched back, seeing in him not a man, but the embodiment of her deepest fears, and perhaps, the herald of her inevitable end. He moved then, not with a sudden start, but with a slow, deliberate unfolding, like a hawk extending its wing. The horse, a dark shape beneath him, shifted, its breath pluming faintly in the chill air. Ilara flinched, her body tensing, every nerve screaming for flight, yet her limbs remained leaden, anchored by a despair that was heavier than any physical chain. He dismounted, the movement economical, almost silent. For a man of his presumed stature, he moved with a surprising grace, a fluidity that spoke of a life lived in harmony with the unforgiving terrain. He did not approach directly, but circled, his steps measured, his gaze, she felt, still fixed upon her. She could not see his face clearly in the gloom, only the outline of his form, the sense of his presence, powerful, contained. Each crunch of his moccasins on the dry earth was like a drumbeat marking the passage of her final moments. She closed her eyes, a prayer forming on her lips, a plea not for salvation, for that seemed an impossible dream, but for a swift end. The wind whispered secrets through the sparse grass, carrying the scent of dust and something wilder, something of him. When she opened her eyes again, he was closer, standing perhaps 10 paces away. He was taller than she had first thought, broad-shouldered, the lines of his body lean and powerful beneath what looked like buckskin. A quiver of arrows was slung across his back, and a bow was held loosely in one hand. His face remained largely in shadow, but she could feel the intensity of his scrutiny. It was not the leering gaze she had sometimes endured from men in the wagon train, nor the dismissive glance of those who had abandoned her. It was something else, something searching, assessing. She was an anomaly here, a broken thing in his world. What did he see? A threat? A curiosity? A creature to be pitied, or dispatched? Her throat was too dry to speak, even if she had known the words, even if she had possessed the courage. He made a sound then, not a word, but a low guttural utterance, the meaning of which was lost to her. It was not overtly threatening, yet it sent a fresh shiver of apprehension down her spine. He took another step, then another. She could see the glint of his eyes now, dark and unreadable. He gestured, a sweep of his hand towards the emptiness where the wagon train had disappeared, then towards her. A question, perhaps. Why are you here? Why alone? The unspoken query hung in the frigid air between them. Ilara could only shake her head, a small, jerky movement that conveyed her utter desolation. Words were useless. Her story was written in her ragged clothes, in the hollows of her cheeks, in the despair that clung to her like the dust of the trail. He continued his slow approach until he stood only a few feet away. Close enough for her to smell the faint, smoky scent of his clothing, mingled with the clean, sharp aroma of pine and something else, something uniquely his. He knelt, not with deference, but with a practical ease, bringing his eyes level with hers. For the first time, she saw his face clearly. It was a strong face, weathered by sun and wind, with high cheekbones and a firm jaw. His eyes, dark as obsidian, held no discernible malice, but a profound, searching seriousness. There were lines etched around them, lines of experience, perhaps of sorrow. He was not young, but not old either, ageless, like the land itself. He reached out a hand, slowly, as one might to a startled animal. Ilara flinched violently, pressing herself back against the cold earth, a small, wounded cry escaping her lips. His hand stopped, hovering in the air between them. He remained perfectly still for a long moment, then slowly withdrew it. He said nothing, but his silence was not empty. It was filled with an unnerving patience, a watchfulness that seemed to strip her bare. He was waiting. But for what? For her to expire? For her to offer some explanation she could not give? The moon, a pale sliver, began to rise, casting an ethereal, ghostly light over the scene, making him seem even more like a spirit of this wild, untamed place. He rose then, turning from her to retrieve something from his horse. Ilara watched, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, unsure if this was a prelude to violence or something else entirely. He returned with a water skin, its surface dark and worn. He uncorked it and, without a word, held it out to her. Water. The offer was so simple, so unexpected, it momentarily stunned her. Her thirst was a raging fire in her throat, a torment she had tried to ignore. Hesitantly, her eyes darting from the water skin to his unreadable face, she reached out a trembling hand. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, his skin warm and firm against her cold, trembling flesh. The contact was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her. She drank, slowly at first, then more deeply, the cool liquid a balm to her parched throat, a gift more precious than gold. He watched her, his expression unchanging. When she had drunk her fill, she offered it back, her hand still shaking. He took it, recorked it, and slung it back over his shoulder. Then, he did something even more unexpected. He produced a piece of dried meat from a pouch at his belt and offered it to her. It was tough, chewy, and tasted faintly of smoke, but to Ilara, it was a feast. She ate slowly, methodically, aware of his silent scrutiny. The food, the water, they were acts of, not kindness, perhaps, but of a practical, life-sustaining acknowledgement of her existence. It was more than her own people had offered her. When she had finished, he gestured again, this time towards his horse, and then to the east, into the deeper darkness where the land rose towards unseen mountains. It was not a question this time, but a clear, unspoken command. Come. Ilara stared at him, her mind reeling. Go with him? A stranger? An Indian warrior? Into a wilderness she did not know, towards a fate she could not imagine? Yet, what was the alternative? To remain here, to succumb to the cold, the hunger, the inevitable predators, both animal and human, that roamed this land. He had offered her water, food. He had not harmed her. His presence, though intimidating, was not overtly menacing. It was a choice between a certain, lonely death and an uncertain, perilous survival. The instinct to live, battered and bruised as it was, flickered within her. She looked at his still, waiting form, then at the vast, unforgiving darkness around her. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself to her feet, her limbs stiff and aching. She took a step, then another, towards him. Towards the unknown. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable in the faint moonlight. When she reached him, he turned without a word and mounted his horse in one fluid motion. Then, he reached down a hand. It was a strong hand, calloused and capable. After a moment's hesitation, a moment in which the entirety of her past life seemed to flash before her eyes, Ilara took it. His grip was firm, impersonal, effortlessly pulling her up behind him onto the horse. There was no saddle for her, only the warm, coarse hair of the animal's back and the solid wall of his body in front of her. Awkwardly, she settled herself, her hands instinctively going to his waist for balance, the buckskin of his shirt rough beneath her fingers. He seemed to take no notice, or perhaps he was merely accustomed to such practicalities. Without a word, he urged the horse forward, not at a gallop, but at a steady, ground-eating pace, moving deeper into the night, away from the faint trail of the settlers and into a world wholly unfamiliar to her. The darkness was profound, broken only by the faint starlight and the sliver of moon, but he navigated it with an assurance that spoke of intimate knowledge. The horse moved with a sure-footedness that was astonishing, picking its way over unseen obstacles, through dry creek beds and stands of shadowy brush. Ilara clung to him, her initial fear slowly giving way to a bone-deep weariness and a strange sense of detachment. She was adrift, cut loose from everything she had ever known, her fate now entirely in the hands of this silent, enigmatic man. The rhythmic sway of the horse, the warmth of his body against hers, the monotonous clip-clop of hooves, it all conspired to lull her senses. Her head, heavy with exhaustion, eventually lolled against his broad back. She expected him to shrug her off, to react with annoyance, but he remained impassive, his posture unchanged. It was a small thing, yet it registered somewhere in the fog of her fatigue. He was not unkind, merely remote. Or perhaps, simply focused on the journey. They rode for what seemed like hours, the landscape shifting around them in subtle ways, the air growing cooler as they gained elevation. Ilara drifted in and out of a light, uneasy sleep, images of her past life, her home, her parents, Thomas, mingling with the stark reality of her present predicament. Each time she jolted awake, the solid presence of the man in front of her was a strange reassurance. He was a constant in this bewildering new world. Sometime before dawn, when the sky was beginning to pale in the east, he finally reined in the horse. They were in a small, sheltered canyon, surrounded by sheer rock walls that glowed faintly in the pre-dawn light. A thin trickle of water ran down one side of the canyon, pooling in a shallow basin. A few stunted pines clung precariously to the rock face. It was a hidden, secret place. He dismounted, then turned to help her down, his hands briefly spanning her waist. She slid to the ground, her legs stiff and unsteady. He immediately set about making a small, smokeless fire, his movements efficient and practiced. He used a fire drill, and soon a tiny flame flickered to life, casting a warm, dancing light on the canyon walls. Ilara watched him, huddled in her shawl, the morning air sharp and cold. He offered her more water, and another piece of dried meat. She ate and drank gratefully, her gaze fixed on the small fire, its warmth seeping into her chilled bones. He sat across the fire from her, his posture relaxed yet alert. The rising sun began to touch the tops of the canyon walls, painting them in hues of rose and gold. In the growing light, she could see him more clearly. His black hair was long, tied back with a strip of leather. A single feather was braided into it. His features were strong, almost hawkish, his skin the color of burnished copper. His eyes, when they met hers, were dark and piercing, yet held a strange kind of stillness, like deep water. He spoke, his voice low and guttural, the words unfamiliar, yet the tone seemed questioning. He gestured to her, then to himself, then tapped his chest. "Hastian," he said, his voice surprisingly soft for such a formidable man. He tapped his chest again. "Hastian." Ilara understood. He was telling her his name. She hesitated, then, pointing to herself, whispered her own name, her voice raspy from disuse. "Ilara." He repeated it, the syllables sounding strange and foreign on his tongue, yet he said it with a seriousness that made it seem important. Ilara, a small nod. An acknowledgement. It was the first fragile thread of connection, a shared sound in the vast wilderness. He then gestured around the small canyon, a sweep of his hand encompassing the rocks, the water, the fire. He said a word in his own language, a word that sounded like Hogan, but it was spoken with a sense of finality, of arrival. This, it seemed, was to be her new sanctuary. Or her prison. She did not yet know which. Days bled into weeks in the hidden canyon. Hastian would leave for long periods, sometimes returning with game, a rabbit, a deer, sometimes with nothing but the same inscrutable expression on his face. Ilara learned to anticipate his departures and returns, the canyon feeling strangely empty and more threatening in his absence. During those solitary hours, she would explore her limited surroundings, her fear gradually giving way to a cautious curiosity. She learned the rhythm of the canyon, the way the sun traced its path across the sky, the calls of unseen birds, the scuttling of lizards on the warm rocks. She washed her tattered dress in the small pool of water, mended it as best she could with a needle Hastian had silently left for her, along with some sinew thread. He provided for her, in his quiet, undemanding way. Food, water, the occasional piece of cured hide that she slowly, painstakingly, began to learn how to soften, mimicking movements she had once seen Navajo women perform in a dusty trading post, a lifetime ago. He taught her without words, or with very few. He would demonstrate a task, how to set a snare, how to find edible roots, how to identify certain medicinal herbs, then watch with that unnerving patience as she tried to replicate his actions. Her failures were met not with criticism, but with a silent repetition of the lesson. Her small successes earned a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Language remained a formidable barrier. He spoke his Dime Bizard, and she her English. Occasionally, a word would seem to spark a flicker of understanding, a shared gesture would bridge the gap, but mostly they communicated through observation, through necessity. She learned the meaning of certain tones in his voice, certain expressions in his dark eyes. She learned that a particular tilt of his head meant disapproval, a softening around his mouth something akin to acceptance. He, in turn, seemed to understand her gestures of thanks, her expressions of frustration or fear. It was a slow, painstaking process of building a new lexicon, one based not on shared vocabulary, but on shared experience. One evening, as the shadows lengthened in the canyon and the small fire crackled between them, he did something that shifted the uneasy balance of their existence. He had returned from a hunt with a young deer slung across his horse. After skinning and butchering it with practiced efficiency, he had cooked some of the fresh meat over the fire. As they ate in their usual silence, he reached into a pouch and drew out a necklace. It was simple, made of polished bone beads and a single, turquoise stone, strung on a leather thong. He held it out to her. Elara stared at it, then at him, her heart suddenly pounding. What did this mean? Was it a gift? A payment? A symbol of something she did not understand? He said nothing, his eyes fixed on hers, his expression unreadable. Tentatively, she reached out and took it. The beads were cool against her skin. He gestured for her to put it on. With trembling fingers, she fumbled with the thong, eventually managing to tie it around her neck. The turquoise stone lay cool against the hollow of her throat. He watched her, then gave a single, curt nod. It felt like a pronouncement, a claim. Later that night, he did not build a separate small fire for her on the other side of their meager shelter, a shallow overhang in the rock face that he had improved with strategically placed branches and hides. Instead, he laid out his sleeping furs closer to hers, leaving only a small, respectful distance between them. Elara lay awake for a long time, the weight of the necklace on her skin, the warmth of his nearness a palpable presence in the darkness. She understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her status had changed. She was no longer just a rescued stray, a temporary burden. In the eyes of this man, in the customs of his people, she was now something more. His wife. The realization brought not fear, as it might have weeks ago, but a strange, complex mix of resignation, apprehension, and a nascent, unfamiliar sense of belonging. This silent, stoic warrior had saved her life, provided for her, and now, in his own way, had bound her to him. The world she had known was gone. This was her life now, in this hidden canyon, with this man whose language she did not speak, whose ways she was only beginning to learn. And as she finally drifted to sleep, lulled by the quiet breathing of the man beside her and the chirping of crickets in the cool night air, a small, surprising seed of acceptance began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. The changing seasons marked the passage of time in the canyon. The harsh sun of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn, and then to the biting cold and occasional snows of winter. Elara adapted, her body growing leaner, stronger, her skin tanned and weathered. She learned to read the signs of the sky, to anticipate the changing weather. She learned which plants were safe to eat, which berries to gather, how to preserve meat by drying it in thin strips. Hastien continued to be her silent teacher, his patience seemingly infinite. He taught her how to weave simple baskets from willow branches, how to grind corn on a flat stone, how to make a warm, waterproof shelter from hides and poles. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to needlework and household chores, became calloused and capable. She learned to move quietly, to observe, to listen. The constant chatter of the white world she had left behind faded into a distant memory, replaced by the subtle symphony of the wilderness, the rustle of wind in the pines, the cry of a hawk overhead, the distant howl of a wolf. Her fear of Hastien had long since evaporated, replaced by a deep, abiding respect, and something more, something she hesitated to name, even to herself. He was her protector, her provider, her companion in this isolated existence. His silences were no longer unnerving, but companionable. She learned to read his moods in the slight shift of his shoulders, the set of his jaw, the look in his eyes. He, in turn, seemed to understand her unspoken needs, her moments of quiet sorrow when memories of Thomas and her past life surfaced. He would not intrude on her grief, but his presence would become a quiet anchor, a reminder that she was not alone. There were moments of unexpected tenderness. Once, when she cut her hand badly while trying to skin a rabbit, he had taken her injured hand in his touch surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the wound with herbs and bound it skillfully with a strip of soft leather. He had said nothing, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a flicker of concern that warmed her more than any fire. The question of his people, his tribe, remained unspoken between them. She knew he did not live entirely alone, that his solitary existence in the canyon was perhaps a choice, or a necessity she did not yet understand. Sometimes, he would be gone for many days, and when he returned, there would be a new tension in him, a weariness that went beyond physical exertion. She suspected he visited his family, his clan, perhaps navigating complex relationships and obligations that she could not fathom. Did they know about her? Did they approve? the thought brought a familiar unease. She was an outsider, a white woman, a relic of a world that was often at odds with his. Would they see her as a threat? A burden? Or worse, a contamination? One day, he returned from one of his longer absences with a troubled look in his eyes. He carried a small, intricately woven blanket, clearly made by skilled hands, not his own. He laid it at her feet, a silent offering. It was beautiful, dyed in rich earthy tones, the pattern complex and meaningful. Ilara touched it reverently, her fingers tracing the raised threads. "It is beautiful," she whispered, the English words feeling inadequate. He looked at her, then gestured towards the east, a frown creasing his brow. He spoke in his own language, his voice low and urgent, the words tumbling out faster than usual. She could not understand the specifics, but the tone was clear, warning, danger. He picked up a handful of dust, let it trickle through his fingers, then made a gesture of many people, many horses, coming. Settlers? Soldiers? She did not know. But the implication was clear. The outside world was encroaching. Their isolation, their fragile peace, was threatened. Fear, an old, familiar companion, returned, coiling in her stomach. Not just for herself this time, but for him, for this life they had built together in the hidden canyon. He saw the fear in her eyes. He reached out, his calloused fingers briefly touching her cheek, a rare gesture of comfort. Then, he began to prepare, his movement swift and purposeful. He checked his bow, his arrows, sharpened his knife. He packed a small bundle of food and water. He was preparing for a fight, or for flight. And Ilara knew, with a certainty that transcended language, that whatever came, she would stand with him. She was no longer the helpless, abandoned widow. She was Hastian's woman. This was her home. And she would defend it. The threat, when it came, was not what she had expected. It was not soldiers, nor a large party of settlers. It was something far more insidious, more personal. Two men, faces hard and weathered, eyes cold and greedy, stumbled upon their hidden canyon, drawn perhaps by the thin wisp of smoke from their cook fire, or by sheer, malevolent chance. They were trappers, Ilara guessed, or perhaps deserters, men who lived on the fringes of the white world, preying on whatever, or whoever, they could find. They carried long rifles and wore expressions of coarse confidence. Ilara was alone when they found the canyon entrance, Hastian having gone to check his snares further up the ravine. She had been tending the small patch of corn she had painstakingly cultivated, her back to the narrow opening. A guttural laugh made her whirl around, her heart leaping into her throat. They stood there, leering, their eyes raking over her, taking in her worn but clean dress, the turquoise necklace at her throat, the signs of a settled, albeit primitive, existence. "Well, now, what have we here?" one of them sneered, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "A little lost dove, all alone in the wilderness." The other one chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "Looks like she's found herself a cozy little nest. Maybe there's room for a couple more." Fear, stark and paralyzing, threatened to overwhelm her. But then she remembered Hastian's quiet strength, the resilience he had unknowingly nurtured in her. She was not that lost dove anymore. She straightened her shoulders, her chin lifting, her eyes meeting theirs with a coldness she hadn't known she possessed. "This is not your place," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Leave." The men laughed again, louder this time. "Or what, little squaw?" the first one taunted, taking a step towards her. "Your Injun buck ain't here to protect you now." Ilara's hand instinctively went to the small skinning knife Hastian had given her, tucked into the waistband of her dress. It was a pitiful weapon against their rifles, but it was something. Just as the man took another menacing step, a shadow fell across the canyon entrance. Hastian stood there, silent as the stone around them, his bow already narked, an arrow aimed steadily at the first trapper's chest. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with a dangerous light. The trappers froze, their bravado evaporating in an instant. The one who had been advancing on Ilara slowly raised his hands, his eyes wide with a fear that was far more genuine than Ilara's had been. "Now, hold on there, Chief," he stammered, his voice suddenly placating. "We was just admiring the view. No harm meant." Hastian said nothing. His silence was more terrifying than any threat. The tension in the small canyon was thick enough to cut with a knife. The second trapper, seeing his companion's predicament, slowly began to lower his rifle. "Easy now," he said, his voice hoarse. "We'll just be on our way. No trouble." Hastian's gaze flickered briefly to Ilara, a silent question. She met his eyes, her fear for him warring with her anger at these intruders. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "No killing. Not if it can be avoided." He seemed to understand. He spoke then, his voice low and deadly, the dying words sharp as flint. Though Ilara did not understand the language, the meaning was unmistakable. Go. And never return. He gestured with his bow towards the canyon entrance. The trappers needed no further encouragement. They backed away slowly, their eyes still fixed on Hastian, then turned and scrambled out of the canyon, their haste almost comical. Hastian held his aim until they were out of sight, then slowly, deliberately, lowered his bow. The arrow remained narked. He turned to Ilara, his expression still grim, but the fury in his eyes had softened slightly. He walked towards her, his gaze searching her face, checking for any sign of harm. "Are you hurt?" he asked, the English words spoken haltingly, but clearly. It was one of the few phrases she had taught him, one he rarely used. She shook her head, her legs suddenly weak. "No. I am all right." He reached out, his thumb gently brushing her cheek where a stray tear had escaped. "They will not return," he said, his voice firm, a promise. And Ilara believed him. In that moment, standing in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, she knew that this canyon, this man, this life, it was hers. And she, in turn, was his. The bond between them, forged in silence and shared hardship, had been tested, and it had held. The encounter with the trappers, though frightening, served to solidify something profound between Ilara and Hastian. It was a stark reminder of the dangers that lay beyond their sheltered existence, but also a testament to their shared resilience. In the days that followed, a new level of comfort settled between them. The unspoken understanding that had always characterized their relationship deepened, enriched by the shared experience of facing a threat together. Ilara found herself watching Hastian with a new appreciation, not just for his strength and skill as a provider and protector, but for the quiet integrity that defined him. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He treated her not as a possession, but as a partner, respecting her growing competence in the tasks of their daily lives, seeking her silent opinion on matters that affected them both. She, in turn, found herself more attuned to his needs, anticipating his desires, her life increasingly interwoven with his inner tapestry of shared purpose. The turquoise necklace he had given her felt less like a symbol of ownership and more like a mark of belonging, a tangible link to this man and this land that had claimed her. She began to learn more of his language, picking up words and phrases from his occasional, soft-spoken utterances. He, too, made an effort to understand her English, his brow furrowed in concentration as she pointed to objects and named them. Their conversations were still halting, fragmented, but they were conversations nonetheless, bridges built across the chasm of their different worlds. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the aroma of roasting rabbit filling the cool night air, Hastian did something he had never done before. He began to speak, not of practical matters, but of his people, the Dine. He spoke of their connection to the land, of their sacred mountains, of the stories and traditions that shaped their lives. He spoke of the Hojo, the concept of beauty, harmony, and balance that was central to their worldview. Ilara listened, enraptured, understanding only fragments of his Dime bizarre, yet grasping the essence of his meaning through his tone, his gestures, the light in his eyes. She saw the pride, the sorrow, the deep love he held for his culture, a culture that was increasingly under threat from the encroaching white world. She learned that he was, in some ways, an outsider among his own people, not by choice, but by circumstance. A dispute, a tragedy in his past, had led him to seek a more solitary existence, though he still maintained ties with his clan, still felt the pull of his obligations. He had never spoken of this before, and Ilara understood the trust he was placing in her by sharing these fragments of his life. It was a gift more precious than any material possession. In turn, she found herself speaking of her own past, of the life she had lost, the husband she had mourned. She spoke of the cruelty of her abandonment, but also of the unexpected strength she had found within herself, a strength nurtured by this harsh land and this quiet, steadfast man. He listened patiently, his dark eyes fixed on her face, his expression unreadable yet attentive. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a profound, empathetic stillness. As the seasons turned once more, bringing the promise of spring to the canyon, Ilara realized that the desolation she had felt upon her arrival had been replaced by a quiet contentment. The emptiness within her had been filled, not by a replication of what she had lost, but by something new, something unexpected, something uniquely tailored to this wild, beautiful place. She was no longer Ilara, the abandoned widow. She was Ilara, Hastian's woman, a survivor, a part of this land. Her transformation was complete, not into a dying woman, for she would always carry her own past, her own heritage, but into someone who could bridge both worlds, someone who had found strength in vulnerability, and love in the most unlikely of circumstances. One morning, Hastian returned from a journey not with game, but with 2 horses, one of them smaller, gentler, clearly intended for her. He also carried a bundle of soft, tanned deerskin, beautifully beaded in the Dain tradition. He laid it at her feet. It was a dress, intricately made, a garment of undeniable beauty and significance. He looked at her, a rare, almost shy smile touching his lips. "For you," he said, his English clearer now. "My wife." Ilara's heart swelled. The words, the gesture, the unspoken promise in his eyes, it was an affirmation of everything they had become to each other. She touched the soft deerskin, her eyes filling with tears, not of sorrow this time, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. The deerskin dress, when Ilara finally donned it, felt like a second skin, a symbol of her complete integration into this new life. It was not an erasure of her past, but an embrace of her present, a testament to the journey she had undertaken from despair to a quiet, resilient strength. Hastian watched her, his dark eyes filled with an emotion she now recognized as a deep, abiding affection, a protective tenderness that had been there all along, hidden beneath his stoic exterior. Their life in the canyon continued, marked by the rhythm of the seasons, the quiet rituals of survival, and the deepening bond between them. They were a world unto themselves, a small island of peace in a larger, often turbulent, landscape. But the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. One day, a Navajo rider, young and urgent, appeared at the canyon mouth, seeking Hastian. They spoke for a long time in rapid Dain, their faces serious. Ilara, though she could not understand all the words, gleaned enough to know that there was trouble, conflict brewing with the Bilagana, the white settlers, or perhaps the soldiers. Hastian's clan needed him. When the rider had departed, Hastian turned to Ilara, his face etched with concern. "I must go," he said, his voice heavy. "My people, they are in danger." Ilara's heart clenched with fear, not for herself this time, but for him. The thought of him riding into conflict, into the path of bullets and hatred, was unbearable. But she knew he had to go. It was his duty, his responsibility. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. She helped him prepare, her hand steady despite the tremor in her heart. She packed food, checked his weapons, her movements mirroring the countless times she had watched him prepare for a hunt. But this was no hunt. This was far more dangerous. Before he mounted his horse, he turned to her, his hands cupping her face. He looked deep into her eyes, his gaze filled with a fierce, protective love. "Wait for me," he said, his voice a low command, a plea. "I will return, Ilara. I will always return to you." Then, he kissed her, a firm, possessive kiss that spoke of love, of fear, of promises made and futures uncertain. It was the first true kiss they had shared, a culmination of everything that had passed between them, everything they had become. He swung himself onto his horse, gave her one last, lingering look, then rode out of the canyon, disappearing into the vast, unforgiving land that had first brought them together. Ilara watched him go, her hand pressed to her lips, the taste of his kiss still warm on her mouth. She stood there until he was a mere speck in the distance, then turned and walked back into the quiet solitude of their home. She would wait. She was strong now. She was resilient. She was Hastian's wife. And she knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in her soul, that their story was not over. This was merely another chapter in a life that had taught her that survival was not just about enduring, but about finding strength in connection, and hope in the heart of desolation. The fire in their small hearth still burned, a beacon against the encroaching darkness, a promise of his return. And Ilara, a woman forged in the crucible of loss and reborn in the embrace of an unexpected love, would keep it burning.